In this lecture, we are going to begin setting up things for how we are going to work with configurations in our application. So I mentioned previously that all our configuration files are going to be located inside of the config folder. So I want to create a configuration file for the application. So I'm going to call this app.php. And inside of this configuration file, I'm going to return an array. Okay, so this is the first thing that you should take note of. All our configuration files are going to return array. And that's going to be an array of key value pairs. So we're going to have a value here called app name. So this is the name of the application. And I'm going to set that to be equal to bug report. Bug report app. And then we're going to have a few more here. So the next one will be the environment. So this is basically going to help us determine where we are currently. Are we in production environment? Are we in development environment? Or are we on our local machine? And then we're also going to have one more, which is called debug. And when this is set to true, it means that we can actually show detailed error messages. But if this is set to false, it means that we are going to just show a customized error message. And that basically means that we are in a production environment where we don't want to accidentally expose sensitive information. And then I'm going to add another one here called, let's call this log_path. So this is going to be the path to our log directory. So that's in our logger folder. So I'm going to go one level up, and then this should be the same level with the logger. All right, so we have the basic configurations that we need for our app. They're going to be more that we'll add later. When we want to add an additional one, we just come here and add a key value pair, and that's it. So the next thing that we want to do now is to provide a way to actually pull out these configurations from this file. So if I want to get the app name, I want to get the env, or I want to get another value, how do I actually get it? So it turns out that in PHP, this is actually really easy. We have different ways to do it, and we're going to just choose one, which I think is a good approach. So inside of my epas folder, I'm going to create a new class here and call this class config. And I'm going to set the namespace to app epas. The first thing I want to do here is to declare street type. So I'm going to say street type should be equal to 1. And the only reason why I'm doing this is to ensure that I actually get the expected value. You know that PHP is not a strictly typed programming language. It means that, for example, if I have a function, so let's say we have a public static function, get file content. For example, I say that I want this to return an integer. If I come here and return a string 100, you see that my text editor complains because right now I've enabled street type declaration. But if I remove this, see that it doesn't complain because PHP is going to implicitly cast this to become an integer, which would just be okay. But I want to actually be sure that if I want an integer or I want an array here, whatever I'm getting back from here should actually be an array. So you see my text editor also complains that it's expected value should be an array, but the string is being returned. So what we want to do in this class is pretty simple. We are going to have two methods. One is going to be to get the specific file content, and then the other one will be to get a specific key inside of the content. So we're just going to break this into two functions. We can actually use one function to do that. So to get the file content, we have to pass it an argument, which is going to be the file name. This is the easiest way for us to actually access files that we have inside of our config. Remember, I told you we're going to have all our configurations here. So let me add a new one. Let's say this is database.php. And then from here, I'm just going to, for now, return an empty array. And if we have another set of configurations, we can actually create a new file. So the way that we can actually determine that we want to access a specific file is to provide the name of the file without the extension. And then inside of here, I'm going to declare a variable. I'm going to call this file content. File content should be equal to an empty array. And then right here, what we want to do is say if, well, let's just wrap this in a try catch block. So let's say try. And then we're going to cache a PHP exception. Then save this in a variable called exception. And here we can have a if statement. So let's say if file exists, if the specific file that was given to us exists. Remember, we cannot directly put in the file name right now. So what we can do is to actually specify the full path. So we can have a different variable here called path. And this should now be equal to repath. Then inside of repath, we can use this printf function to pass in a formatted string. So we want to be sure that we are inside of the config folder. So we're going to go one level. And then here, check, we are in config. So once we're in config, we want to go inside of config and then look for this specific file, which is %s. So %s here is a placeholder we're going to replace with the file name. Then we can say .php. And then here we can pass it the file name. And now I can take this and bring it here. If file exists, then we are actually going to set file content to be equal to that file. So we're going to just require this, or we can just require path. So require path. And then here we can actually return file content. But if this is not the case, if this file doesn't exist for some reason, there's going to be a fatal error. And actually, we cannot cache the fatal error using exception, but I'm just going to do this for illustration purpose, and then we'll come back and fix it. So what we can do for now is to just die the message. And I'm pretty much sure that there will be no message returned from here, because if the file is not found, it's going to actually be a fatal error, which cannot be handled by the exception class. So let's test this out in the index file. We have a function here, get file content, that accepts a file name and returns an array. And then we are doing a check to see if the file exists. If it does exist, we just require the content, which is going to be an array, and then we return it here. If it doesn't exist, then there's going to be a fatal error, which we attempt to undo here. But as I mentioned previously, we may not be able to undo it. So let's see what happens. So right here, we're going to say config. It's going to be equal to our config class. And then we want to get file content. And then the file that we want to get will be app. And right here, we can do a var dump of config. So config. And then from my command line tool, I could just say php index.php. And here I get actually the content from that file. All right, so let's go back again and try to force an error to occur. So let's run it again. And now we get a fatal error. And as I suspected, this is not being handled. And the reason is because the fatal error is not part of the PHP exception. Let's come back again right here. So instead of actually saying cache the exception, we can actually say cache a throwable. Throwable is the interface that the exception class actually implements, and the fatal error should actually be inside, should actually be captured when we use throwable. So let's see if we can get it now. Let's see. And here, right, we actually get a really simple message which is being returned by the exception now that we're being handling. So what we can now do, okay, so just for right now, we're going to come and update all of this later when we actually start creating our own custom exception. So what we want to do will be to throw a new exception. So we're going to throw a new runtime exception, and then we can pass it a custom message. So we could say for this runtime exception, we want to have our own custom message, which is let's use printf again, printf, and then say the specified file, and then we can actually provide the name of the file. So let's use a placeholder, %s was not found, and then we can then say file name. And now let's try to just run that again. Okay, so on called runtime exception. So this is okay because we are actually throwing this exception now. You can see the message here that I passed in, the specified file, blah, 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 was not found. Okay, so this is the way that we actually want to display error messages if we are on development environment or we are local environment. If we are in production environment, we don't want to do this. We just display a simple message, and I'll show you what we'll do later. So let's get back again to our config class, and then here, since we know that this works fine, we're going to have a new method here. So it's also going to be a static method, and then we're just going to say get. And basically get is going to also take two arguments. So it's going to take the file name, which is going to be a string, and then it's going to take the specific key that we actually want to get. So let's say that this string is going to be also a key because we are actually using associative arrays. So let's say this is a key, and we expect this to return an array. Okay, so this is really up to you. You can actually expect this to return whatever you want, but I am actually wanting this to return an array because whenever I use this method, I actually want to get the entire content from the file. So what the first thing I'm going to do here, so let's set this to be equal to null. So let's say you don't give us a key. So we are going to set the initial value for the key to be equal to null, which means that you can just specify only the file name and then we return everything from that file. But if you actually want to get by the key, I think in that case, maybe we don't need to make this return an array. Okay, so maybe we don't need to specify the return value here to be an array, but we'll see later. So first thing first, we want to say the actual file. So the file content should be equal to sef get file content and then pass it the file name. And then here we can do a check to say if key is equal to null, which means the user is not supplying any key. So let's just make sure we are using triple equal. So if key is equal to null, we are just going to return file content. Otherwise, we're going to return, see if it's set, file content key. So we return that specific key from inside of the file content. So if it says file content key. So if that is true, we will return file content key. Otherwise, we just return an empty array. So pretty much simple. We first of all get the content of the file. If the key argument here is null, then we want to just return the content of the file. But if the key argument is not null, then we want to get that specific content from inside of the file. So I would see maybe a few use cases where it may still be necessary for us to just return an array and deal with the other use case of getting a specific value. Like for example, if I want to get inside of app the app name, so if I use this function to say the file name is app and then I want to get a key app name, this is definitely not going to return an array. This is going to return for me a string. Okay, so which will make this function actually throw an exception, because we also have a strip type declaration here, and again we are saying that we want an array. So maybe we can make it flexible to say, oh, we don't really necessarily need it to be an array. It could be an array or it could be a string. So let's just remove this. And then right now we can come to index.php, and instead of saying get file content, we can now just say get. So if we say get, and then we say app, and then put a comma here and say app name, app underscore name, and then do a var dump, and then we get a string bug report app, which works as we actually expect. So let's come back here and say we just want to get app, and now we get the entire value, which is what I actually prefer, because if we are using this in a class, we get the entire content and then we can map these to individual methods or individual variables instead of calling them one by one. So it all depends really.